Ken Krugler is most recently a consultant and a significant member of the Apache Pinot community, the Apache Flink community, a fixture in the data space for a long time. He's got a fascinating background before that, which we talk about a little bit on the podcast. I have him on the show today to get his thoughts on open source. A lot of real-time analytics technologies are open source, so this is an important thing for this community to think about. He's a guy with a wealth of knowledge on the subject. This is a little bit of a longer conversation for this podcast, so plan accordingly, but he's got a lot of great things to say. I just had a great time talking to him. So listen in on this episode of the Real-Time Analytics Podcast. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Real-Time Analytics Podcast. I am your host, Tim Berglund, and I am joined in the virtual studio today by Ken Krugler. Ken is a number of things, and I'm gonna let him tell us what those things are.
Wow!
Ken, welcome to the show.
Okay, let's see.
I was going to start to say like a person involved in the Pinot community and a Flink expert, but I'm like, no, Ken.
Okay. Well, one of the things is as of a week ago, I'm retired, but my definition of retirement is not the same as most people's. It means I only work on fun things.
This is the face of envy that we're looking at right now. I hope not in a bad way.
Okay. Yeah. So no more payroll or workers' comp or, that stuff, but I might work for consulting wages if it's interesting.
Sure. If it's fun. Yep. That's the thing. They got to make it fun now.
Yep. It's so great. It's so freeing. It's like, tell me why I should work on your project. How fun is it?
Am I going to have a good time?
Yeah. So that's one thing about me. I feel like I've earned this. I started off at Apple in '83 working on the Lisa and then the Macintosh computer.
I did not know either one of those things. What was your role on those?
The Lisa computer, it's like, the new kid, what do they do? They write the installer. They, the Mac, I was the Jackie Robinson. They were merging the two groups and they were trying to show that they could, because there's a lot of animosity between them in those days, intentionally in a way. Jobs kind of fanned those flames.
Yep.
Yeah. But they're like, well, we need somebody to come over and prove that you could go from the Lisa group to the Mac group. And I was the young guy. So they're like, okay, let's have Ken do it.
Wow.
So it was an interesting time at Apple. And then I moved to Japan and I worked on the Japanese Macintosh and I got into this whole international space for a number of years. Korean, Chinese, Thai, Tibetan, Arabic. I called it the revenge of my German teacher in high school because I hated German. And I told him it was a worthless subject. Everybody speaks English. And there I was knee deep in the Arabic lunar calendar. Like, how do you do that? So I did that for a couple of years and then I started a consulting company and first it was all about the same kind of thing, internationalization. Companies would hire us to look at their code and modify it so it'd work with all these interesting non-Latin based writing systems.
Right. Yeah. Was a big transition.
There's many, yeah. And then I took a break. We were in Hong Kong and I started getting involved with the Palm Pilots back in the day and wound up doing their internationalization for Japanese and Chinese and Korean. And
okay, see, I only know you as a data guy. I don't know any of this.
It was a weird transition because in 2004 I took another break and I was like, God, search is really useful for programmers. I wonder if you were going to build a search engine for programmers, what that would look like. And so that was my startup, Krugler. It was like we indexed all of the open source code in the world, like several billion lines of source code at the time.
SourceForge at that time.
Yeah, SourceForge and Eclipse Foundation and Apache. Those were the big heavy hitters. And that's what got me into big data because before that, like working on the Palm Pilot, it was like, every byte matters, every cycle you got to count, every pixel is precious. And suddenly it's like, well, we're going to spin up
more like firmware development.
Yeah, it was super low level. Yep. Yeah. And then suddenly it's like, well, let's just spin up 20 or 30 fire-breathing servers and, unleash them. It was an interesting. It felt like I had the hammer of Thor's hammer. Like suddenly, I'm just looking for a problem to hit with this big data processing technology.
Right.
And we were using Nudge. That was my big exposure to open source. We were using this web crawling software called Nudge and this search engine called Lucene.
I was going to say, Nudge was precursor to Lucene or
co-evolved? After. So, Doug Cutting did Lucene first. And then he's like, we need to create a people's search engine because like having these big companies in charge of search sucks. So
was he currently working for Yahoo?
No, he wasn't. It's funny that he did wind up working for Yahoo, but he was like, let's create our own search engine. I mean, how hard can it be? So he created this Nudge open source project. And then they're like, we're having some scaling issues, and Google wrote this paper on the Google file system and this thing called MapReduce. So let's create this thing called Hadoop that was part of Nudge. So like I was one of the first Hadoop users because it was coming out of the Nudge project, and we were using it to process all this source code. And we're using Lucene. And then there was this new project called Solar that CNET had just open sourced January 2006. So we started using Solar. And we were heavy users of this project called Tika, which is for extracting text content and metadata from files. So it's an Apache project. And that eventually I became a committer on that project. And then I got voted in as an Apache Software Foundation member. And that sort of is how I got more and more into the open source space and the big data space. Sadly, most of our big customers for Krugler were banking industry customers. And so the 2008 financial crisis was not good timing when you're trying to raise money.
Okay, I was going to say, why is that sad? But that was timing-wise very sad.
Timing-wise, very bad. And so one of our funders was a bank, and they got nervous and they called their loan, and so we had to sell, and that was kind of the end of Krugler for me. But then I started a consulting company, Scale Unlimited, and that's since then consulting on big data projects. So
took you across the finish line in the sense that a week. I just feel I didn't know this podcast episode. I'm going to think of it as the celebratory Ken's retirement podcast.
Thank you.
And so you get to talk about whatever you want on this episode. And so and thanks. I always like to know how people got to where they are. And that's a great story. And especially this week, it's worth marking all those things. But
I'm trying to remember where we first connected, because it was like 2010 or 11. It was something around training, or
could have been Cassandra, maybe.
Yeah, so I was doing a lot of work for DataStax at the time.
So it must have been that.
Okay,
I not a lot, but I was like doing some webinars, kind of short form training. That were somewhere in between online training and webinar.
Right.
That was I later went to work for them a few years after that.
Right.
With a little GitHub stint in the middle there. So
nice. It's interesting because I love teaching. So that's one of the things I'm still doing in retirement is I'm teaching classes on Flink for Viverica. It's always, teaching professional education classes is, I also teach like kids how to program. I've done that for a number of years.
That, by the way, and I don't know if anybody else among our listeners right now is interested in this part of the conversation. I hope you are, and I hope you stick with us. But that right there, that's my retirement gig. That just, I can't. I can't wait to get there. It's
super fun
making training videos. Why not make them for kids? Right. Not that it hasn't been done, but I would like to do it better.
Okay.
By then, my grandchildren will be old enough to, maybe those who are interested start.
Well, it is kind of funny because I started teaching right around when my daughter was in middle school. I started doing enrichment classes, local middle school, and she had very little interest in programming. Sadly. She's doing her own thing, which is great, and it got me into, doing this volunteer teaching thing.
Neither of my daughters had any interest in programming at all. My son had some, and when he was 12, the kids were homeschooled. We did this homeschool enrichment science fair project that was really an engineering project. There was no
Right.
science to it, but do what I want. I mean, it was more educational this way. And there was some hardware design. There was some C code. It was integrating a Wii remote with this hovercraft. It was just great, right? And after that, he's like, yeah, I think I want to focus on trumpet and music. And well, hello, Zach. He's a web developer now.
Okay.
And when I need help with Next.js, and CSS and things, he's my guy. So
perfect.
Anyway, let's talk about you're an Apache Software Foundation member, a lot of involvement in open source. I mean, you've got thoughts. I'd kind of like to pick your brain. And, this is the Real-Time Analytics podcast. It's not the Tim and Ken Talk About Life podcast, but I actually kind of like that. It is, however, very true that almost every important technology involved in proximity to real-time analytics is an open source technology. Not all of them, but most of them. So this is worth some reflection. As somebody who's been a part of the space since the term was a term, what are your thoughts?
Okay. Well, I gave a short talk about this at it's like one of those, 5 minutes to explain open source or whatever at some big tech conference. But I talked about, in 5 minutes, I had a lot of caffeine. I was talking really fast, but I talked about 3 different things. And one was picking the right open source project. Right? Because one of the beauties of open source is there's lots of options. Even inside of the Apache Software Foundation, there are multiple projects, both actually real projects and in Incubator, that are all kind of about the same thing. And the philosophy is really let the best project win. And so you have lots of choices. I mean, back in the day, it was do we do Cassandra or HBase? That was a very common question.
I remember that. I interestingly also remember the do we do Cassandra or MongoDB question. I literally got that question a lot, which to me betrayed, I say in the kindest way, an ignorance of what those things are.
Exactly.
But yes, you have options.
So how do you pick the right project? And let's say you've done the level. I mean, the way I assess projects for myself was different than the way I'd assess them for my clients. For me, when I'm looking at projects, I'm which ones do I think are just now getting to the point of being interesting? They're the things that in 2 or 3 years are going to be significant. And I want to get started with them now, because if they get hot, then we're in a good position to provide consulting for them.
Yes. And you've got 2 or 3 years of experience.
Exactly.
There are, 10 people on the planet who know them as well as you do, and that's wise for, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm looking at when I'm assessing those projects, it's, it still is about the community, and I'll talk about that, why the community is so important. But it's also about sort of where that project's goals are versus where I think the industry in a whole is moving, and are they going to match up? There are projects that are too soon, and what they're trying to do isn't going to, whatever I don't think there's going to be a lot of companies with money to spend on consulting projects wanting what they're doing in 2 or 3 years.
Ahead of the market.
Ahead of the market,
in terms of your 2 or 3 year
Right.
gap. They're still several years ahead of the market. And
Right.
It's not going to be any fun.
Okay. Right. So it's sort of like trajectories. Are they lining up? That's one of the things. For clients, on the other hand, and it's totally okay if it's the 0.2 release, of the thing. It's coming out of Incubator. Usually I try and hit them when they're coming out of the Incubator in the Apache Software Foundation, or that phase in other projects, in other organizations.
All right. That was Pinot a year and a half ago.
Right. It was Flink 5 years ago or 6 years ago. But for clients, they don't want the 0.2. They don't want to base their business on the 0.2 release in general, right? So we're looking for more mature projects, and also ones where there's more know-how out there, because my dream project is proof of concept. Great. Let's actually build something out and hand it off. And now they'll need to be able to find, people to work on it that they can employ, et cetera. So
that's a lot of ecosystem at that point when you can hire people who know the thing. That's in terms of this discussion, a great deal of maturity.
Right. I mean, at least a couple years, right? They've been at conferences. There's training available. Those are sort of some of the signs that it's far enough along, right? And And for that reason, I've sort of stayed away from projects that use, I mean, I know I'm going to get some hate for this, but use funky languages, right? Like a project written in, Erlang. Okay, that might be the best language to write this thing in, but the odds of finding developers who know that language and the technology and are there to support it are very low. And I don't want to level up for some language that I've used playfully a few times,
Exactly. And it's not that choice wasn't itself the platonically perfect choice and it's the best language, etc. It's just that there's only a few of the cognoscenti who know enough to be there,
right?
Yeah. Which is actually, maybe it wasn't a good choice of language, but that's a different podcast.
I mean, right. And that's one of the reasons why I was a little bit nervous about Flink and its use of Scala, because I looked at Scala and I'm like, is it really gonna, and it felt like it was, I'm like, oh, maybe I made a mistake. And now I look at open source projects and they're trying to remove Scala dependencies from their code.
Yes. That is a more typical move at this point.
Yeah. So anyway, so there's this, picking the project. One of the key things you do not want to do when picking the project, and I'm talking about this for a client, is there's a lot of benchmarking that goes on out there where somebody has a benchmark that proves just how much better option A is than option B or C. And there's a whole bunch of issues around benchmarking, because almost everybody doing the benchmarking has a bias, right? It's especially bad when they're like the primary supporter for the project.
Right.
So anyway.
Mark Twain, I've said this before, but Mark Twain wrote about benchmarks. He said, in the hierarchy of truth telling, you've got liars, damned liars, statistics, and actually benchmarks are
below. Right. Yes.
It's not that any vendor lies. I mean, I'd be shocked if somebody actually just freaking made up numbers, right? That would be audacious. It's just that you run a test, you take measurements, and is there an agenda? Yes. I mean, I work for a database vendor. I'm sure the time's going to come when we're going to write a blog post that's got benchmarks in it. We're going to want Pinot to seem fast and StarTree Cloud to seem fast and whatever.
Right.
The key point is that test is devoid of real world context.
Right.
So to me, it's interesting to say Cisco did a bake-off between some real-time analytics databases.
Right.
What did you do? Because that's a real system. You don't give a crap which one's fast. You care how your system works.
And I wish more companies published the results of a good internal bake-off, because that is gold. That is like so rare and so useful.
Link in the show notes, but go on.
Anyway, and the other thing is that I tell people about benchmarks is it's rare. Just two things. One is it's rare that the success or failure of your project is going to be predicated primarily based on how fast you can push records through your system. That's typically not going to be the thing. And it's really hard to do a benchmark that covers your specific use case, right? Because what you're doing, you have really wide rows versus, tables that have just a few, it's so specialized that it's very hard to generalize from what is a general benchmark to your specific use case. Right. And so I say, don't start there. Sure, you can read them. They're entertaining often, especially when you have comments on them and you have people you start seeing it starts off pleasant discussion and it can devolve quickly. But don't start there. So where I start with is typically I look for who's writing about it. So I look for non-vendor people writing about the technology. What do they say? Yeah. And do I respect them? Are they somebody I know, or based on other things they've written, does it seem like they have a good point of view? I look at the community. So let's look at the mailing list. Let's look at what's going on the Slack channel. Because
those are the things you look for: mailing list, Slack channel. Go into as much detail there as you can. I'm super interested.
Yeah. Well, so there's a couple things there. One is, there's clearly like level of activity. Like you can look back, for example, for Apache software projects at how many emails have there been on both the user list and the dev list for a project over time. And you can see how's it trending. And I mean, if you're talking about a mature technology, you kind of want it to be trending down. Like, you don't want to have a whole bunch of people saying, hey, what the heck is,
things can be done to some degree, right?
Right. At some point, let's call it good. But it is an interesting, especially for a lot of these projects, they're evolving quickly. So that gives you a sense of how it's trending in the community. But there's an even more important aspect to it, which is kind of the tone. Whether it's a community that's going to be helpful and welcoming, because if you are engaging, if you're using open source, you have to assume that you are going to be actively engaged with it, that you are going to be asking questions and maybe finding problems and having to come up with workarounds and maybe even doing pull requests to fix things or to improve things. Like you are going to be engaged with community if it's a successful project. So,
and what's it going to be like?
So you're dating, right? So what's it? Yeah. So like, what's the vibe here? And I mean, there are some open source projects that I have been involved with that I have backed off from. I'll push the Apache Software Foundation. It's the one I know, but that's one of the reasons why you need an organization that is acting as kind of the oversight committee, if you will, of all these open source projects, where when there are problems, there's someplace outside of the project itself you can go to try and help resolve it, right? When things inside the project are just not working out, you can raise it up a level. And
so talk to us about that. We're, I mean, I work in the Pinot community. Pinot is an ASF project. You've got deeper roots in the foundation than I do, for sure. So that level of governance, probably shouldn't assume that all our listeners even know the project governance models. If you want to give a quick summary of that, but then what is the escalation pathway, and kind of sell us on the ASF?
I'm definitely not the best person to sell you on ASF, because there are people who have served on the board and who have been like these PMCs, which are sort of like the project managers for projects, and I have not. There have been release managers for projects. I have not. Like, there's all kinds of levels of involvement. I've given talks at Apache events, but there are people who are really ASF ambassadors, right? Who are out there actively spreading the good news, and that's not me. I can tell you how I've seen it work in projects. It is kind of a meritocracy. They try to make it a meritocracy. Like you earn karma sort of by contributing things. And if you contribute enough and show a willingness to work within the sort of environment of the project and the framework, then at some point you can be invited to be a committer on a project, which gives the ability to review other people's changes and to create your own sort of commits that get accepted.
Basically, you can push commits to the repo.
Push commits to the repo, right? And you don't. And most people aren't Apache Software Foundation members who are doing that. You don't have to be a member to be committing to a project, and you don't have to technically be a committer on a project to be a member of the Apache Software Foundation. Though typically that's the path people follow. And then, you can become somebody who's sort of acting as the chair of the project, right? And you have responsibilities like writing regular release reports that are submitted to the board. You sort of
board of the foundation?
Of the foundation, right. And the board can reject the report if there's not enough.
Yeah, I'd hate to be a part of the committee that reviews the minutes.
It's hats off to that group. Hats off to that group. Right. Yeah. You have other involvements. Like there are people who act as mentors for projects that are in the incubator. The process of becoming an Apache Software Foundation project is first you're in the incubator, which is sort of like, let's see what kind of legs this project has. Does it have involvement from people other than everybody at one company? Right? Is there a diversity of the community? So it's not just a company's project. Are they making regular progress? Have they done all of the legal stuff of making sure all the code can be under the Apache Software Foundation license, right? Everybody who's committed code has a contributor license they've signed. There's all these steps. Is the name okay to use? The name they want to use? Like, are there trademark issues? There's all this nuts and bolts stuff.
Pepsi or something.
Yeah. Again, so at some point, you graduate from the incubator if you've passed, all of the tests essentially, and then you become a regular project. And you can also become a project sort of spinning out of another project, just like Hadoop sort of spun out of Nutch.
Then Hadoop gave birth to many
projects,
children.
Right?
Yes.
So yes, there's a.
So if there's a problem, so there's a committer, and then there's the project management committee, which is a subset of the committers, and they vote on releases, big changes. What do they?
So if you're a committer, you get to vote on releases.
All committers vote on releases.
All committers vote on releases. There's no, like, the PMC doesn't have like a special extra, this special +1 vote. In that sense, they're just like anybody else. They have mostly extra admin responsibility. Tries to be very flat in a way, hierarchy.
Certainly. And flat and meritocratic.
Yeah.
And if there is conflict in the project, you said there is a way to escalate to the foundation.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
That is helpful. Helpful.
And, in general, it's like, try and, can you just work it out amongst yourselves on the playground? Like, let's not get does the teacher really need to get involved? But, sometimes things don't get worked out. Like, somebody who's a committer does a commit and somebody undoes the commit. And that's usually like shots fired. Like, that is, that's
passive aggressive.
Yeah, that's I've seen that a couple times where that's
aggressive.
Yeah, that's that means things are not good. That wasn't the first thing that happened. That's just the sign that things are really bad. So circling back to how do you assess an open source community, the fact that everything's fairly transparent, like should be on the mailing list or in Slack, means you can get a pretty good feel of what the community is like. You can also look at, the issue tracking system, whether it's Jira or they're using GitHub or whatever. You can look at, what kind of issues are getting filed? Are people responding to the issues, right? Like, when somebody asks a question on the mailing list, does it get an answer? Or when they ask a question on Slack, does it get an answer? Right? So that's useful stuff if you're trying to figure out, am I going to be able to work well with this project?
And that's there's kind of two communities there. There's community of developers, the committers and those people, and then there's the broader community of users.
Right.
And you want to see vibrance and I'll just say kindness in both places and collaboration.
Yes, helpfulness. So I think there are other things you can do that are more objective, because that's all pretty subjective. Mm-hmm. Like, you can look at, like, with GitHub, a lot of everything's in GitHub just about that I work with. So, go get the pulse of the project. Like, what's the rate at which things are being contributed over time? Like, it gives you that graph, which is very useful. And you can assess the bus factor. Like, is it one person doing 90% of the commits? Okay. That could be of concern if you're really all in on this particular technology. In some cases, it doesn't matter as much. There's like a bunch of different, JSON parsing libraries. So, like, somebody.
That is always the example I use of little throwaway component, right? Like, that's fine.
Right. Yeah. Versus, if there was one person who was contributing 90% of the code on Flink, that would be bad. Even if they're brilliant, even if they're the most amazing coder ever,
their life is but a vapor.
Right. Yes. So,
yeah.
All right. So there's, so those are some of the things that, obviously there's other stuff like, what license does the project use? And is that going to be acceptable? I mean, almost everything I deal with is Apache license now. Very, very few things are like, LGPL or, whatever, some of these weird. Yeah.
So the, what I'm hearing, this is super affirming what I'm hearing, and maybe I'm just putting it through my own filter, but what I hear you saying is the health of the community and health, you've broken that down in a lot of ways, is a key contributor to, your technology adoption rubric.
Is this going to be a successful outcome here?
Final question. We're running long for this podcast, but
wait, I'm finishing up on point 1 of 3.
I know, right? we have to do this more, as long as it's fun. Otherwise, you don't have to do it, right? So, but we were talking about the Apache model, and you're in a place in life where you can name names, and so I'm going to put my own self on the table there. There's a tension in the Apache model where the Apache way where you, for prudent software engineering management reasons, don't want the bus factor to be 1. The values of the ASF don't want one company to be controlling a project, right? And so if you're coming to the ASF with, one company has made this and hey, let's make it an Apache project, but then this other thing happens. And so just in terms of my own, this isn't really about me, but my own employment history, my last 3 companies have been based on Apache projects, right? And there have been some successes and some not successes in those companies' relationships with the ASF. So a thing happens when a project is successful that the company hires engineers who work on the project and they pay them money to work on the open source project. And then that suddenly becomes the cool place to be, where all your friends who are committers and your other collaborators and all the smart people who know this stuff and work on it. And that there's a certain center of gravity. It pulls more committers in. That's natural because people get to make free choices about where they work. And we all think that's great. But then so it seems like success creates this contradiction in the model. Your thoughts?
So yes. And there's another factor there as well, because for people who aren't employed by somebody whose business is built around the open source project, they don't get to spend 100% of their time working on the project. The project is a means to an end, right? It's like we are doing this thing inside our company X and we're using this open source project Y. So yes, you can spend time working on it to further X, but it's not like that's their 100% deal. And that makes a difference, especially.
It could be if it's a strategic investment.
Right, but it's less common. Typically, it's a couple people in a company. And it is less common across a lot of companies. You see a lot of contributions. If you look at the contributions there, you'll see a lot of 1s and 2s. Like I've had a couple contributions to Pinot, and those were because a client had something that needed to be done with Pinot. And so, open source for the win, like here's a patch and it got accepted and great. But they're not paying me to further Pinot. They're paying me to solve a problem that uses Pinot.
Right.
And that is fundamentally different then in terms of how much time I can spend on it, where my focus is, right? And so it's not just that a project is successful or not. It's that it's really, if it's successful, the company that's backing an open source project has the resources to hire more people who are full-time on it.
Yes.
And that then does create an imbalance. And it's almost like, and no, I don't wish this at all for StarTree, but when a company goes through problems, a company that is backing an open source project, and I've seen this a couple times, there's almost like creative destruction. When people leave that company and go to other startups or start doing other things that still involve that same open source technology, now you can actually get a blossoming effect. So
vendor built around open source project
implodes a little bit.
Some attrition.
Right.
Engineering,
right?
We'll just say,
yep.
And now there are other places, and the job they're going to get is with that technology because they're the best in the world at it, and that's what they want to do. So now you've got this more diverse community.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, that's
in the case of the project and the company being successful, and that center of gravity existing. I would say that's. I'll name names in a positive way. I would say that's confluent, right, with Kafka.
Yep. Totally.
And that's. Actually, if you look at the distribution of committers and work and everything, StarTree and Pinot and Uber and LinkedIn, and there's actually a pretty diverse community. So it's not a thing right now.
But
could be.
Could
and
be.
You don't want to do that in a way that is unfaithful to the values of the ASF.
Right. Well, I'm glad you brought up Kafka, because that is a good example. With Kafka, there is a thing of what's the schema that you're using for serializing and deserializing records.
Mm-hmm. And how do you manage that?
Well, how would you manage that? And if you go looking for that, all you find is Confluence schema registry. And the
correct.
code that you can drop in easily that's baked into a lot of open source projects is built on the Confluence schema registry. And if you don't want to use the Confluence schema registry, it actually winds up being non-trivial. It's not immediately obvious. How do I, for example, with a Flink workflow, like deal with my own schema without using the Confluence schema registry? And there's a reason for that, because, Confluent has developers that like contribute stuff. And so it's there in all these open source projects, and that's a win for them. I understand why they do that. But it does mean that everybody who's working with Kafka in other projects has friction that wouldn't be there otherwise, because of the economic sort of goals of
friction if they don't want to use the Confluence schema registry.
Right.
Okay.
So, I don't know. That's like a low point to end on. I don't want to end on the low point. Okay.
I don't want to end on a low point, but it's
an important thing.
It's an important thing, and it's an important thing that, I don't mind discussing in the open, because this has a lot to do with what I do in developer relations at a company whose cloud service is based on an Apache project. Right. That's my job.
Right.
There's a trajectory in which that it becomes more interesting as a committer to work for that company.
Right.
And you don't want then to you want to steward that mass very carefully, that mass of committers and intellectual capital very carefully, in a way that doesn't betray the principles of the place where the project came from, and maintains positive community membership going forward.
I mean, back in the day with Hadoop, when Hadoop was getting big, it was because Yahoo adopted it, because they're like getting crushed by Google and they don't have their own big data processing platform. So they adopted Hadoop, and they put the resources behind it that was necessary for Hadoop to be able to scale up to thousands of computers. Without Yahoo, who's got the resources to let's spin up a test cluster with, 1,000 servers. But they have a dedicated ops team, right? So they cared not that much about the quality of Hadoop error messages. And so for years, that was a sore spot with Hadoop, where, because it didn't matter to Yahoo, and that's not them being nefarious or anything. It was just you're scratching the itch.
Create vendor lock-in or
no. I mean, it was just
the open source version. It's nothing nefarious.
No, they just cared less about it, and so
it emerges from their constraints and their incentives.
Right, and so it's interesting. It's sort of like evolution. Okay, why did this animal evolve this way? It's because of the environment around it. There's a lot of context there, and you'll see that with open source projects. So I am interested in seeing what happens with Pinot, with the context in which it's evolving.
My guest today has been Ken Krugler. Ken, thanks for being a part of the Real-Time Analytics podcast.
Thanks for having me. That was fun.
And there you have it. If you feel compelled to help us spread the word and grow the Real-Time Analytics community, you can give us a rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or wherever fine podcasts are sold. If you're watching us on YouTube, hey, subscribe and, of course, hit that notification bell. And you can always share your favorite episodes on LinkedIn or Twitter or wherever it is you do social media. Thanks, and I look forward to talking to you in the next episode.